All right, take two on Rabbit Trails podcast. Hit record and didn't hit record, so we weren't recording for that first minute and a half.
No worries. It wasn't that interesting.
Honestly, so a little bit of a deep dive or a view into behind the curtain for the folks at home. Earlier today, I was removing ear hair from the side of my ears. We've now reached that level. And Garrick, you and I often talk about the weather, and I had the thought in our first introduction, oh my gosh, we've turned into old people who talk about the weather.
Old people talk about the weather.
So here we are. So let's not talk about the weather.
Well, let's not. But you can reference a great song by REM, which makes us seem old too.
Which also makes us seem old.
REM, those guys are really old. But in the 80s and 90s, they had, what was that? Was a pop song in '99 because should we talk about the has a line? Should we talk about the weather? Should we talk about the government? Anyway, yes, I was thinking. I don't know why I was thinking about REM all of a sudden.
Apropos of being old, I had a conversation with my son the other day. Conversation is the mild word for it. He was heated, which means I probably was heated too, because I have two gears, passion and anger. So I'm not sure if I was passionate or angry, but anyway, we were talking. He was not wanting to clean up something and make his bed before going to play with a friend. It's summer. He made the comment of, all I want to do is just go and play with my friends. Is that such a big deal? And I said, Quinn, I'd like to go and play with my friends. I was cooking dinner and I said, I'd like to go and play with my friends too. And he goes, you have friends? so jab, stab. I'm an old guy with ear hair talking about the weather and REM.
And REM, which is a great band.
It is a great band.
But those guys are like all in their 60s now.
I know,
right?
Right?
It's hard to conceive of that, all the cultural markers of our youth are now old.
Buddy, the world has moved on.
Yes.
Oh gosh. Well, hey, listen, I figure let's get right to it. We're going to do,
jump in.
The next few podcasts are going to be shorter for the listening public. And then we might take a little bit of a break for summer because this is Europe and we get vacation.
Yes.
No. It's not
to
exactly
rub it in.
Not to rub it in, but it's not exactly that. But it will be good to have a break, and we recognize that the world is going to take a break. So
we need to do a podcast on that, on taking breaks.
Actually, Sabbath, that would be an awesome podcast. I go back to, I think I may have mentioned this on the podcast, but there was a Greek guy who once mentioned to me, we were in a friend of mine, actually Michael Meditol, has been on the podcast. We were in Greece doing a debrief there, and a Greek guy running a little convenience store made a comment. He said, "You Americans," he said, "you live to work. We Greeks work to live."
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, that's actually a really profound statement. Anyway, so lots to learn there, but that's not our subject for today. Our subject for today, Garrick, what is our subject for today?
I think we wanted to keep going on a little bit, talking about secular culture, particularly in Europe, but this also applies to really anywhere in the, I hate to say Western world, but kind of what we would maybe say secular leaning world, right?
Yeah.
Australia, North America, probably even a lot of universities around the world, or elite institutions. Definitely Western Europe, where you and I work. But you and I have been kind of working through some books by a guy named Stefan Paas, and he's got a great book which I highly recommend: Pilgrims and Priests, Christian Mission in a Post-Christian Society. And he's got lots of wisdom, lots of ways of helping us unpack and think about the culture we're in and what that means for mission.
Yeah.
Because I think we all experience this at some point. And Paas writes about the crisis of mission in Western Europe, particularly, and how do we understand? You see a lot of people hit it, and they just it derails people. And maybe can cause us to question our faith, which is not actually a bad thing, but it can be a derailing factor. What I think you and I've noticed is people tend to go in two different directions. One is pretend it's not there and keep doing the same thing that works everywhere else, or just come to this kind of hit a wall and go, well, this isn't going to work. So It's time to move on. And what I think you and I have always been interested in talking about is like, how can we help ourselves primarily, but also others who we work with and lead and partner with. How can we help them see what's really going on here and understand it within a Christian and biblical framework? So it's not one of these two things. So we become effective, but also we become understanding of what's happening in and around us, to us in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think there's I think one of the things that Poss really brings up that I think is or his perspective on things that's beneficial is that he's in the middle of it, but he has an ability to pull back when and kind of look at it from a very 30,000 foot view, but he brings in a lot of context of history. So he kind of reviews what is the European, what is the history of the church in Europe? What's the context of that, and where do we find ourselves today? He kind of throws in some of the Enlightenment in there. He reviews some of that, the Reformation, what it was, the good with the bad. He brings in just a lot of different contexts. In his first book that we mentioned, which was, and I'm blanking on the name.
Church Planning in the Southwest.
Yeah. He doesn't mention a lot. He doesn't take into account a lot of more the Pentecostal movements as a result of sub-Saharan Africa or Central or South America. He does a little bit more in this book, and so I was happy to see that. But I think you're right. I think the thing that can be, it's discombobulating, I think, is the way I would put it. So one of the ways in which I would describe Europe is, imagine if you are in the Tokyo subway, okay? It's just tons of people moving around you, pushing on you, everything else. And so you know that's coming, right? So you plant both feet. Okay, that's traditional. And so you're able to kind of take the hits and move with them. That's what I would say is missions in a context like where I first did it, Central Asia. I knew everything was different. I landed and everything was so different. And so I firmly always tried to have my feet planted on me. And I was constantly questioning, constantly thinking. One of the most difficult things to do, now, this is as a foreign missionary. I'm not necessarily sure that a Swede thinks this, but as a foreign missionary in Western Europe, one of the things that's most discombobulating is the fact that I'm now standing in that same rushed area with people going by me, but now I have one foot pulled up. Everything looks similar, and I'm expecting it to be exactly the same because it feels Western. It feels things that my familiarity level with it is so much. And so that's why but there's just enough different that I pull up one foot. And when you get hit, you get knocked over and you go, what on earth was that? Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of people have that feeling when trying to apply or trying to think through certain modes of mission in Western Europe. And then it becomes discombobulating. And so your response is, well, I've just got to try harder, or I just give up, or I blame the outsider. So, or the insider.
Or I'm doing something wrong.
Right. Yeah. And where Poss seems to be getting is that maybe it's not any of those. Maybe Europe is a certain way. Yeah. And so you and I were talking about the way Europe is. So how would you describe, or how would Poss describe, and how would you describe Europe?
Yeah. Well, and I'll make one quick comment too. I think what you brought up is really, really important, is that there's layers, right? So there's the European secular culture, but under that is afterwards Spanish culture, which is the whole. So you're often dealing with, multicultural, but a lot of stuff coming in different areas, and so it's not going into a village. Which traditionally we think mission is going to a tribe or a village, which is very homogenous in how it thinks. There's a lot of control, and it's got kind of one gear. And not to say it's not complex or anything, but what we're dealing now in Europe, and probably a lot of the the modern or late modern, whatever you want to call it, postmodern, late modern world, liquid modern, is we've got these huge layers of culture, which sometimes even in the same person push and fight against each other. but your question, Poss. So Poss makes a very interesting case, which I think is maybe really helpful for us. He makes a case that probably Europe has never been particularly Christian, and that you've always had a core, and that maybe that core is shrinking. The core of people who are 100% in and ready to go, and they're the committed. They're the people who fund missions and go on missions, who are church and become priests, become pastors, who are deeply into faith. It's not an obligation. It's their will, their choice. But beyond that, Christianity, because post Constantine, accepting Christianity, has had this other group of people, and what he calls it is vicarious religion. People who look at religion and go, "Hey, that's cool. It's good for me because I can get married there. It provides that service. It gives some. I can bring my kid there and he gets baptized or christened, and that provides some kind of entry point into society or belonging, or I know if I have a problem I can go to that church. So it's not a bad thing, but it's this distance. So it's called vicarious religion, where there's a distance.
The way that he describes it that I thought was really helpful is he described it as Europeans look at church like the hospital.
Yeah,
you don't want to go there. Yeah. But you are certainly glad that it exists should the need arise for you to go there. Yeah. And I thought that was a really helpful perspective, and I would agree. So sorry, continue.
No. I think that was great. I really like they called what the Dutch call it was like church on wheels, because it was like the hospital, right? So and I think you see that in Spain a lot, because you see a lot of in Spain what I see is you see anti-clericalism. Right, so people are against the church. You see some atheism, but you see mainly people just like, I'm not really interested in it. But there's a strong. You can still put in your taxes that you want to give money to the church.
Right. Yeah.
You can still, most people, if you start talking really badly about the Catholic Church, they'll get like, whoa, excuse me. So it's interesting that there's still some kind of tacit support. Now I think he makes a point that that's dying out, that vicariousness is so it's not as easy to find people who are interested in, who are distant from the church but still positive, or distant to Christianity but still willing to go. If you were to bump into them on the street and share the gospel with them, they would have a more positive response, or might even begin to move towards Jesus. So I think that's kind of his bigger idea here.
Yeah. So a couple of things to that extent. Obviously, there's spectrum. Obviously, every country, and then regions with it. One of the things that you and I were having a conversation about all the different languages in Spain the other day, of how different regions. Like, what was it in Valencia? You could actually learn what is the name of the language there?
Valenciano.
Yeah, Valenciano. Like, I had no clue that Valencia had its own language, because I'm ignorant. But in Europe is kind of that way. It can be very regional, because it wasn't just these nation states that we see today. However, I would even say, so as I reflected on Poss a little bit, Sweden, in the context which I think is on the cusp of atheist agnostic,
very, very much.
And I think it's extreme in the sense of how far it is on those regards. So people still want, in large measure, the church. So if you push an ethnic Swede, and you say, "Hey, what is your belief?" They'll be like, "Well, I'm atheist agnostic. I'm not religious." They're not really interested in those things. But interestingly enough, they don't want to see the institution of the Swedish church killed. They want to try to preserve part of that history, or at least a good measure of them do. And so what I would say is, I think that what is reflected in Sweden in that sense is the person who is mostly atheist agnostic. They're passive agnostics. So they kind of say, I don't know, don't care. And I actually think that would jive or work well with what Poss is saying, is that a lot of Europe has not ever been particularly religious.
Yep.
Actually, I think Ed Stetzer makes this point about America is that, or maybe it was Rasmussen. I forget who it was. Anyway, one pollster or something makes the same point of America, is that the high point of American involvement in church was the 1950s and 1960s. That was the high point. And before that, it was actually always a minority of people. So one of the things that Poss gets to in his book, Pilgrims and Priests, that he eventually really develops, and I think it's an incredibly important idea, he looks at First Peter in talking about the remnant of people, and talking about this idea that we're pilgrims, that we're priests to a world that in large measure has rejected Christ. He really looks at that as a framework of how to do missions in this secular culture. I really think that it's the beginnings of a really good way of thinking. The question I have, and this, we can talk about this maybe a little bit, is that defeatism. So what we're essentially saying is, look, Europe's never really been fully Christian in the sense of, you've had these people who would consider themselves Christians, have been in the church, but not really in an evangelical sense, have never taken their faith very seriously, maybe even don't actually really believe the gospel or fully understand it. We're kind of conceding that point. And then there's next steps that need to follow. But I think my first question that I want to talk about is that just defeatism? Are we just saying, hey, Europe's just always been this way, don't worry about it? And then what does that have to say about mission in the endeavor that we're involved in?
Mm-hmm. A couple things. So I think that's a great question, and I hadn't really considered it too much, because I can see people, because there is a sense of mourning, right, that we have to go through, that to realize that the things have changed. That's a big thing in the missional conversation about, leaving what we assumed or thought was this one thing, and maybe it was never that, and that's necessary to do. So let's see. I would say on the flip side of that, he makes a very strong case about this, the dying of vicarious Christianity. He says it really interestingly. He says, when Christianity does not have this wind in its sails, so the wind that Christianity is culturally inviting, or it looks good to people to become a Christian, right? So there's not to say that people would then make huge choices to follow Jesus because it looks good, but it makes it a lot easier to make that jump, right? When he says when it doesn't have this in its sails, there will still be people who convert for individual reasons, but mass conversions and great revivals will most likely not occur. And I think so. His thing, that's what he's saying, is like the you have to have a certain kind of a mass of people who have a vicarious interest in Christianity, for those people then to make in large groups or in large streams of people go into that. So I think him helping us helps us to see why that's not happening. Is that defeatism? I don't think so. I think biblically we look at things and we don't see that mass conversions, mass movements. I don't think we see that even in the history of the church. That's normal. There should be growth. There should be people coming to Christ. But if we look at the Muslim world, I think we are seeing in some places some pretty big movements. But that's after years of trickles and trickles of one or two people. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that Europe has been through cycles of this. I mean, I think if you think, the famous book, How the Irish Saved Christianity, or saved Europe. Civilization, right? And how that was a movement. That was a movement originally of a guy, St. Patrick, and a handful of very committed missionaries going into a very dark, difficult place, Ireland, which was at the time the fringe of the fringe, where you didn't want to go, and how they came in and through the gospel changed the culture. At the same time, there was a massive, breakup of the Roman Empire. There was a massive breakup of European Christianity, where it collapsed and where people left the church, and the Irish went back in and re-evangelized. And that was kind of what, so I think at the same time, we've been through these cycles. That doesn't mean at some point Christian growth isn't going to happen again. but it means maybe we should not be the ones expecting it. We should be the Patrick who goes in and sees a handful of conversions, but it's his disciples or disciples after that who continue to, continue to see growth. And
yeah, so I think that's a really great example. So there's a couple of thoughts there that I have, because I think this is a really important point to make. I don't think Poss is saying, don't pray for revival. I don't think Poss is saying, and I don't think we would say that. I don't think I would say it's never going to happen. What I think, though, that a shift that has occurred in my head is, I think I assumed the gospel, that the ultimate goal was mass conversions. So I need to preach. I need to move people onto a movement that ultimately would roll down a hill.
Yeah.
And I think what Poss is helping me to see, and as I'm rereading First Peter, and as I'm considering some of these things, what I'm seeing is that faithfulness is actually the goal. Yeah. And I think that I had a sense of no. It has to be this. We have to see large numbers of people. And if we're not seeing large numbers of people, because the gospel is powerful, the gospel will create movement. Jesus wants all people to be saved. Therefore, if you're doing it right, you'll see numbers. And what I'm coming to the realization of it is I actually think, no, that may not necessarily be the case, but that doesn't mean that we're not doing what Christ says we should do. That doesn't mean that we just lay down and we say, well, we're never going to preach again. It just means that there's this realization that in many places, if a faithful remnant is all that exists, we rejoice in that remnant because it's reflecting Christ well. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important distinction to make. And I hope it's clear, because I think sometimes it's easy to hear these things and go, oh, you're just saying it's not, the gospel doesn't work. And that's not actually what I'm saying. No. I'm saying that in some measure, the people that we're speaking to are persnickety and don't necessarily want the gospel, but that doesn't mean that the gospel isn't true. I think we do a real disservice when we attach numbers to the efficacy of the gospel.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It's a dangerous game.
And I think you get to a key point here, to kind of follow along a bit more with Poss here in this chapter. He says, for the first time in a long history of Western Christianity has to learn what it means to do mission without, in almost every respect, being stronger than the receiving culture.
Yep.
So in Western Europe, Christianity is not seen as something that brings something positive, that brings maybe even economic advantage. It doesn't have a leg up in any way, shape, or form in Western Europe. And so he goes on and says, mission in the more secularized West areas of the West is a matter of harvesting one by one. So I think he's saying, and I think Newbigin, a lot of these guys would say, okay, we're going back to a time where it's a liminal, unknown time because Christianity's died out. So it's not going into a culture that's never had Christianity. But it's becoming like that. And so what we're seeing is a need to shift our expectation away from big numbers. But then I think his kicker is, he says this, at the same time, this means a serious crisis for Christian mission, which is what we're talking about. Because for the first time in a long time, Christians must learn what it means to be weak and foolish.
Yeah.
But so that's a hard lesson to learn. But I would say that's exactly the lesson Jesus asked us to learn when he says, take up your cross and follow him.
Yep. Yeah, so that's very much his point, right? Is that part of mission is learning what it means to be like Christ. It's learning what it means to give up your rights, to submit to him, to love others. It's an incredibly difficult thing. So he also says that, I feel like we're reading it a lot, but there's some really profound thoughts here. He says decades of post-war missional thinking have been characterized by finding the most effective missional structures, models, but in the end, there are no missional structures, only missional people. It's impossible to engineer ourselves into the mission of God. In a sense, we need to find out what it means to receive mission as a gift rather than a task, as a way of being that has its reward in itself rather than in what it produces.
Amen. Yeah.
It's a paradigm shift for me, but it's a freeing one in a lot of sense, because it says my first and primary goal is to make Jesus known and to reflect him, but it doesn't mean that it's not a strategy. It is a being.
Yeah.
And that's a really healthy thing.
Yeah. No, I think it's huge, and I think it forces us into this position to realize we're in a different position, but we're in a more biblical position.
Right.
And if you want to get into the whole decolonization stuff, that's a whole other conversation. And I think there's some critique there that was right? Of like, okay, when you come in power, there you lose something.
Yep.
But I do think most missionaries came under they subverted power more than and control more than even sometimes they're aware of. I believe that because the essence of the gospel, even though when it gets caught up in cultural issues, is still the servant king who died for his people, which is that message is profoundly revolutionary and radical and controversial in the world we live in. But in this thing, we're maybe more and more disentangling ourselves from, but it's hard. We're disentangling ourselves from that slick, cool, maybe that's what it is now in our day. It's Christianity has to look cool and slick and be, air quotes, relevant, when in fact maybe that's never what it's supposed to have been.
Yeah, so I think some of the big takeaways so far from PAS, and as we reflect on Europe, are that it's not a new situation that many people are not interested in the gospel, but that they see some utility in some kind of faith, but admire it from a vicarious distance.
Yeah.
That's not a new spot. And as the world increases in secularity and postmodernism, that we shouldn't be surprised that that's the case. I think the other thing that's important to remember, and this was probably for another podcast, but the question of, does the gospel mean there's always increasing growth in numbers to the point of full acceptance as a society? I think PAS makes the case that is not the case, in which case I think we do have to revisit some of our missiology, some of our thinking about it. I think some of the best missiologists would agree with my statement there, but I don't necessarily know that the literature of church planting and or missiology from a popular standpoint assumes that.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think for me, I think just continually the big takeaway is, look, if you're in a tough situation, do not be discouraged, because the gospel is good enough and powerful enough and worthy enough to change lives and to be worshiped, or rather Jesus is to be worshiped, not the gospel. But I think we miss that because we as humans, and I know I've done this, tend to tie up our value in our production.
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous game.
Yeah. Well, the book here, so the novel to read on this, the best novel I've ever read on missions is Silence by Shisako Endo, which they made a movie.
Right.
The movie's fantastic as well, but the book is even better and more powerful. But it is a clear renunciation of this concept that success it will follow after Jesus. And the message of that book is no, Jesus does it all, and Jesus has it under control. And whatever you can offer, Jesus is happy with it, but he will take care of you. He will take care of it. He will take care of what happens, and we need to simply trust in what he did for us on the cross. So it's a great book. I highly recommend reading Silence, because it's a little bit of Europe. Where is God when it seems that he is silent?
Hey, if anyone ever does a comparison of Japan and Sweden, they come away thinking they might be the same country. So I think anything I can learn from Japan, I can apply in Sweden. So it's good stuff. Garrick, always a pleasure, man.
Awesome, man.
We'll continue to delve into PAS. Yeah. For those of you listening, if you could, like us on iTunes, give us a review, pass us on to some other people, help us discover new listeners. We'd appreciate it. Send us a message. Send less constructive messages to Garrick Regner. Send very constructive messages to me. All right. We'll talk to you later, man.
Adios.